All right, the topic for the day is forced migration. So we've already talked a lot about voluntary migration, which is for the most part economic in nature, especially when you're speaking about international voluntary migration. So forced migration is permanent movement, usually compelled by political, cultural, or environmental factors that is not voluntary. So oftentimes these sort of factors that we're talking about, some of the push factors, would be things like political persecution within the country, violence, civil unrest, uh, or some sort of environmental natural disaster, or um, kind of the worsening effects of climate change for the environmental factors. So some of the terms that we're going to talk about within this topic are refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced persons, and then environmental refugees or climate migrants. There's not really an agreed upon term yet. So when we're thinking about push and pull factors for forced migration, again, we're talking a lot about, especially with refugees and asylum seekers and IDPs, we're talking a lot about political push factors that compel people to leave countries against their own will or against with not much of a choice. So as we've talked before in class, oftentimes kind of the line between voluntary and forced migration can be a little bit blurred, especially when you're talking about people in less developed countries who suffer a variety of kind of cross-cutting or coinciding hardships. Forced migration has some um, pretty specific definitions. The most specific being the definition of a refugee. So this is a term you hear a lot, but in this class we have kind of a fairly strict definition for what is a refugee. And we stick to the sort of official United Nations definition of a refugee. So a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his or her nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear is unwilling to, avail him or herself of the protection of that country. So you can see kind of the underlying important phrase, a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. So refugees oftentimes are kind of originate from countries who have oppressive governments or who have some sort of civil unrest or civil war or ethnic violence or ethnic cleansing or genocide within the country that is that forces people to move kind of and threatens their lives. So we'll talk a lot in class about refugees and what the kind of hardships that refugees face in different situations across the world. All right, so we're going to go pretty light with the term internally displaced person. I have a video that you're going to watch that goes with this, but essentially an internally displaced person is essentially has the same definition as a refugee, except does not leave the borders of their own country. So they are displaced internally within the same country. So for example, within Syria, many of the people who were displaced within Syria during the Syrian civil war and the civil unrest and violence within the country actually didn't leave the borders of Syria, just moved to safer parts of the country. And you can see, I think this is a map from 2014, but you can see a lot of the countries that you hear kind of in the news of as producing lots of refugees. So you have the Syrian crisis, you have various civil wars that in the Sudan, the South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo that have produced a lot of refugees within Central Africa. You have the persecution of the Rohingya, a ethnic minority in Myanmar, and you have some sort of still lingering violence from conflicts in places like Colombia and Afghanistan. And this map is from 2014. So there's another map from a little bit more recently. You can see a lot of the same types of numbers or circles within this map. All right, so the last term we're going to talk about is an asylum seeker. So this is very well connected to the term refugee. So essentially, an asylum seeker is a refugee who has left the country of his or her origin, traveled to a new country, and then once you make it to the new country, and try to claim a legal status as a refugee in the new country, then you are an asylum seeker. Okay, so an asylum seeker is someone who claims to be a refugee, but whose claim is sort of not yet evaluated or in the process of being evaluated. So this person, basically, you go to a new country and you apply for asylum on the grounds that returning to his or her country would lead to persecution, based on some of the factors in the definition of refugee that we talked about. And not every person that claims this status is accepted, and in fact, many people are not. So thinking about kind of political refugees across the world and some of the trends that we see. So this is an interesting graph. This is from last year, but this is essentially the amount of legal refugees admitted to the United States. And it actually shows you their region of origin. So you can see kind of the changing region throughout the years. And you can see the different places in which they've come from. So it's kind of an interesting map. You can see how oftentimes that it pairs with social or political conflicts throughout the world. And the last topic I want to talk about is sort of a growing and interesting type of forced migration. So one that's starting to be in the news a lot, and doesn't actually have decided upon language yet. So you sometimes see the term climate refugees, environmental refugees, or climate migrants. But this is kind of an interesting quote. Over coming years, migration flows related to climate change are expected to increase, particularly in the world's poorest countries. This is because climate change is expected to increase the frequency and severity of extreme environmental events such as drought, sea level rise, floods, and hurricanes. So essentially, there's always been climate migrants and climate refugees and people who flee their place of origin because of things like hurricanes and earthquakes and fires and things like that. But that number is growing kind of throughout the world. And what's interesting, kind of that's changing or that's being discussed a lot, is kind of the legal status of people who are being forced to leave because of the impacts of climate change. So you're seeing a lot of discussion, a lot of really interesting discussion around kind of the legal rights of climate refugees and people that might need to travel to a new country because of things that are happening within their country. And this is a map of kind of the greatest risks of climate-related kind of migration in the future. So a couple regions that sort of stand out are the Pacific Islands. So you've already actually started to see some people being forced from their homes in some various low-lying Pacific Islands, Kiribati and Tuvalu and Nauru and a few of the islands here. You're starting to see programs to relocate people from those islands to places like New Zealand and Australia and some kind of countries in their region. And you also see kind of throughout the map, the orange spots or the yellow spots represent areas that are at risk of greater desertification or drought. So essentially, places that are kind of on the outskirts of deserts that are where the farmland and the kind of the soil within this area is kind of at risk for erosion and desertification and becoming less arable. So essentially, the worry is that would cause kind of wide-scale migration in a lot of those places. The blue dots you see are areas that are at risk for floods. So essentially, depending on the severity of some of the impacts of climate change in the future, there's anticipation that kind of climate refugees and climate migration will become a much bigger part of forced migration in the future. All right, thanks. Bye.